So we are maybe going to get chapter 14 of Matthew done today. So, and we are covering, as I was reviewing stuff, the thought came to me that this chapter sort of covers a lot of human behavior from a lot of different types of human behavior and godly behavior too. So,
one thing that you might want to do is that in the on the Matthew page that we have, there's a video that covers chapter 1 through 13, and that video is just a very short video, but it gives you an overview of what we've done so far. And so that's part 1 of the Matthew video, and there's a link on that Matthew page on the church website down at the bottom of the first page. There's a link to that, but it was really interesting to see that in hindsight and go through that overview.
It is, yeah, because I noticed in my New Jerusalem Bible that with the story, the end of chapter 13 with Jesus going to Nazareth, that my Bible starts that as the beginning of another section, which they title the church, First Fruits of the Kingdom of Heaven. So anyhow, okay, so so we're going to start off with the story of the death of John the Baptist and Herod and Herodias and Herodias' daughter Salome. So Sarah,
Ready.
All right, if you read verses 1 through 12.
At that time, Herod the tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, "This is John the Baptizer. He has been raised from the dead, and because of this, these deeds of power were." For Herod had seized John the Baptizer and had bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John insisted to him, "It is not right for you to have her." So he wished to kill him, but he was afraid of the crowd, for they regarded him as a prophet. On the occasion of Herod's birthday celebrations, the daughter of Herodias danced in public and delighted Herod. Hence he affirmed with an oath that he would give her whatsoever she might ask. Urged on by her mother, she said, "Give me here and now the head of John the Baptizer on a dish." The king was distressed, but because of his oath and because of those who sat at table with him, he ordered the request to be granted. So he sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought in a dish and given to the maiden, and she brought it to her mother. His disciples came and took away the body and buried him, and they came and told Jesus about it.
Whew. That is a gruesome story to me. But there is a good amount of background, and if you guys are already familiar with this, pipe up and say so. First, to get the Herod family tree a little clear. So, there was Herod the Great, all right, and Herod the Great was this Herod's father, and then he had, sons, and it apparently at least 2 of them, this one and another one, were called Herod. The other Herod, he was in Rome. Most in other places in the gospel, he's referred to as Philip. All right. So we got Herod the Great, and then he had a bunch of sons, and at least 2 of them were called Herod, but in the gospel, one of them is called Philip, and he's in Rome. And then this Herod is here in Galilee. All right. And so when Herod the Great died, his territory or his lands in this part of the world were split up between 3 of them. And so this Herod got Galilee and another piece of property.
Samaria, I think.
Yeah, it was, it's referred to, I don't know. Yeah, whatever. But anyhow, he has Galilee. Galilee itself, I mean, I knew it was kind of small, but it's only like 50 miles from north to south and about 25 miles east to west. So,
Rhode Island.
Huh? Rhode Island? Oh, okay. All right, you're frozen, Sarah. Yeah, I was picturing it sort of like from Richmond to maybe just south of Fredericksburg, and then Midlothian over to New Kent, sort of. Anyhow, so Herod, this Herod, he was originally married to a woman who was the daughter of the king of the Nabatean Arabs. And so then he and Herodias was his sister-in-law. And so somehow or another, he decided he wanted Herodias, or Herodias wanted him, whatever, something happened. So he divorced the wife who was the daughter of the Nabatean Arab. And so he divorced her, which was technically against the law for him to do, because he didn't have a real reason to divorce her. So then he married his sister-in-law. And so, needless to say, Herodias was apparently not quite a woman of many virtues. Barclay describes her as being stained by a triple guilt of loose morals, infidelity, vindictive, and then the worst of all, she didn't hesitate to use her own daughter to get her own vindictive ends. So a little family drama there. And having come from an event yesterday where my ex-husband's 3 wives were all together at one place. But we had a nice time. We had a nice time. So, anyhow, so that's a little family history about Herod. All right. Another piece about Herod, at the first verse that Sarah read, it described Herod the tetrarch, which tetrarch was the ruler of a fourth part, is what the official translation is of tetrarch. So basically it's a subordinate ruler. But Herodias, so I read, Herodias wanted him to be king. So so she got Herod to go to Rome and ask to be king, because he didn't like being just a tetrarch. So, yeah. But so some Bibles translate that tetrarch as king, some, and then Barclay, and I think the NRSV now translates it as tetrarch. But all right, so this incident, as far as John the Baptist and his death and how that all came to be, some of this we know from the writings of a guy named Josephus, who we've referred to Josephus. Can any of you tell me what you know about Josephus?
Just that he was a Jewish scholar, wrote a lot of history.
He did. So I looked up in my little handy dandy reference book, Bible reference book about Josephus. He was not a contemporary. He was born in 37 AD. So he, from 37 to 100 is when he lived. And he was a Jew. He was born in Jerusalem. As a teenager, he even went off with the Essenes for a while, spent some time with them, then came back to Jerusalem and identified himself as a Pharisee. All right. So he is there in the area as the church is, really first starting. Okay. He then got involved. Then in 66 is when there was the war between the Jews and the Romans, and the temple got destroyed. Well, Josephus ended up on the Roman side and ended up going to Rome and was favored enough there that he lived the rest of his life on a pension from the emperor. So we don't have all of his writings. There's only, apparently he wrote a number of books about the history of that time, but there's only 4 of them that survive. One of them is an autobiography, and apparently it was popular enough that when the Puritans came to the United States, of course, they would have a Bible. If they had any books, the first one they would have is a Bible. The second most likely book they would have was Josephus' autobiography.
Wow.
So
have to put that on your summer book list.
Actually, I may go home and read it. I have a copy of translated all of his existing books on my bookshelf at home.
Only
Yeah,
Sarah.
That does it.
Shocker.
Yeah.
Shocker, she said.
Shocker. So anyhow, so that's a little bit about Josephus, and apparently in his autobiography apparently repeats much of what he wrote in his books about the history of Judaism, which he wrote apparently as sort of a reaction to a significant anti-Semitic movement going on to I guess restore faith in, or whatever, support for Jews at that time. And a lot of it was a repeat of the historical books from the Old Testament, or a rewording of historical books from the Old Testament. But anyhow, in his autobiography, part of the additional information is about his, there was another guy who was a historian, quote unquote, at that time. And apparently there was a good amount of competition between the 2 of them. So his autobiography supposedly includes about his rivalry with this other historian of that time. So I say all that because Barclay quotes Josephus and what Josephus wrote about John the Baptist. So that's, you know, and the other thing about Josephus is there are, I think there's maybe 1 or 2 references to Jesus, but he does also write about John the Baptist. So that's why Josephus's name comes up from time to time when we talk about Jesus's ministries as well as the early church. So Josephus talks about this Herod of Galilee as, you know, not a particularly great person, that he talked about Herod fearing lest the great influence John had over the people and what threat that would be to his power. So anyhow, so that's just an interesting aside. So I like how Barclay, you know, Salome, Herodes' daughter, I mean, this passage doesn't refer to her by name, but there are other in, I think it's in Mark and Luke that the story also is, and I think her name is included in there. So anyhow, her being basically she's being used by the adults around that are supposed to be looking out and taking care of her. So, and Matthew's story is the only one that refers to John's disciples going and getting his body and then taking it to bury it, which can remind us of Jesus's death and his body being buried by his disciples. So, anything you guys want to add or observations about Herod as being a weak man in essence, being very threatened by John, being very easily influenced and power hungry?
Nothing changes.
Yeah, so a repeated pattern, right? History repeats itself. Yeah.
Wondering about the writings of Josephus, and you said there was another historian that was kind of his rival. You know, jokingly, it reminded me of fake news and so forth. But I wonder if those writings are available and to compare and contrast what's
I
been.
don't know. This article just refers to this. This other writer was Justus of Tiberias. Was his rival historian. So, you know, and there are some folks who have.
Sarah has that one.
Only the best of, not the whole collection.
Yeah. Oh goodness. Well, Josephus apparently had, definitely had his own perspective about stuff, so sort of going along some of the fake news and stuff. He had his own interpretation and apparently made no bones about it. So is sort of the impression I've had over the years of folks talking about him. So
People in that day and time didn't have the same thought about historical accuracy that we do today.
right.
So so he wouldn't have any compunction about putting his own slant on it, and that just was expected for that day and time.
Yeah.
And
they
that's
didn't have-
different from today. How?
So
Right.
there are a couple of things that strike me in this whole conversation about our time versus that time. One, he wrote books, which were probably really scrolls, and they probably weren't widely circulated. I don't know how about that. So I just wonder about that aspect. And then early on, when you were talking just about the area, the region, how small it is and so forth. And our perspective, at least my perspective of the world, is informed by the country I live in, which is what, 4,000 miles across or something like that.
Yeah.
And, it's just when you think about your country being the size of a city, really, in some cases, or pretty much. I mean, it's 25 miles from our house to Short Pump, so, and that just changes your whole perspective of everything.
Yeah, and I did, me, I've got to do some calculating. When Barclay talked about the size of the country and the population of Galilee, the per capita, the density, thank you, of Galilee was 3 times that of Chesterfield County.
Oh wow. And
Yeah.
yeah.
On a per square mile population density, Galilee was 3 times denser than Chesterfield County.
Wow. All right. So that plays into the next passage. All right. Because the next passage is the feeding of the 5,000. Is Matthew's version of the feeding of the 5,000. And so as we go into this, my other commentary that I looked at really made the point about how Matthew purposely has this story about Herod and the killing of John the Baptist, because there was some kind of event or feast going on, for John's head to be brought in, to show it off, versus this story of Jesus and the feeding of the 5,000. So that sort of the juxtaposition of these two. When the Gospels were written, the order, each of the authors had a purpose in the placement of the different stories and how they organized the stories. So
And also in this story, it mentions that Herod actually lived up to the promise that he made because of the people that were sitting with him. Of the people that were the people that were there, at the table with him. And so he might have made a different decision if he had been there by himself with his wife and and stepdaughter.
Mhm. Who was really his niece.
No, niece. Okay.
Yeah, but complicated family. All right, so Susan, do you have your book? Okay. Susan's in Indiana for those of you that joined. Susan Butter in Indiana for those of you who joined late.
Okay. When Jesus heard the news of the death of John, he withdrew from there in a boat into a deserted place alone. When the crowds heard of it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he had disembarked, he saw a great crowd, and he was moved with compassion for them to the depths of his being, and healed their sick. When it had become late, his disciples came to him. The place is deserted, they said, and the hour for the evening meal has already passed. Send the crowds away in order that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food. But Jesus said to them, give them food to eat yourselves. They said to him, we have nothing except 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He said, that should be fish, right? 2 fishes.
Oh, yeah.
He said, bring them here to me. So he ordered the crowds to sit down on the green grass. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes and looked up into heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. They took up what was left over, 12 baskets full of the fragments. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, apart from women and children.
So just let that sit for a second, the contrast between the two stories. So as Sarah was talking about the density of the population, just to further illustrate it, Barclay says so in this area that we talked about, that's about 50 miles by 25 miles, 204 towns, none of which had less than 15,000 people in them. So it, which just kind of overwhelms me that the population was that dense, at that time in the world. So, and then the Sea of Galilee itself, at its widest point was only 8 miles wide. So, which sounds like a fairly good sized lake, but when you look at it on the maps today, it doesn't look all that big. So these people see Jesus. He's obviously, to me, I interpret it that he's trying to get off by himself to grieve the news about the death of his cousin. So what does this passage, this story about feeding the 5,000, what does it tell us about Jesus? First, he's trying to get by himself to grieve, but there's these thousands of people that come to him. So what is the first thing that he does?
Serve.
Serve.
Puts
Yeah.
their needs ahead of his own.
Right. He was moved with compassion for them to the depths of his being and healed their sick. And then the disciples, being the practical guys that they tended to be, they were like, hey, we got these thousands of people, because Matthew was saying it was 5,000 men plus women and children. The other 2 gospels just say 5,000. So, but Matthew delineates the crowd, describes the crowd a little bit differently. But anyhow, the disciples are like, whoa, we got, it's getting late here. These people are hungry. All right. So, Jesus is like, all right, let's pull out what we got. Let's see what happens. Are there other times that we have seen that kind of miracle?
Maybe that was the beginning of the church potluck dinner.
touche. Yeah, the number of times it will be like, we don't have enough food, we don't have enough food. And then we have, you know, lots left over. Oh, I can give an example that I heard about yesterday. Well, I learned more about it. In rural counties, there are no homeless shelters. There is nowhere for homeless families to go. So, you know, they end up staying lots of times in all kinds of weird and bizarre and very challenging situations. But a couple of years ago in Louisa County, there was a couple who, I guess they had moved to the county. He was a doctor and she's a social worker. And they put together and got built a shelter for homeless families in Louisa County. And I got to see it. I'd read about it a couple, when it was first built a couple years ago, and then I got to see it this week when I went up to visit a friend. She took me by to see it, another social worker up there. And so this shelter for homeless families, each family has its own little apartment with 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, a living area, and a little dinette kitchen, little efficiency kitchen. Plus there's a bigger room and kitchen for everybody to eat together, but if the family needs to stay by themselves, they can. I don't know of a facility like that in the Richmond area. But little Louisa County, through a lot of prayer, and as my ex-husband's third wife told me yesterday, she felt it was an act of God, and I can't disagree with that, has this phenomenal facility for homeless families. And they continue to live on prayer because they're not getting regular funding from everywhere. They're living off of grants. They're all the time having to search for grants and have fundraisers and that kind of stuff. That's how they continue. And they, because not only do they have this facility with these multiple apartments in it, they have a house nearby that the families can stay for 18 months in the apartments, and then they can move into this house that's a 3-bedroom, 2-story house where they could live for another 18 months to help further their progress along and getting back on their feet. So it's pretty amazing. So, but that's the most recent story I can think of, and I think others of us can think of stories too, in addition to our potlucks.
Well, I'm thinking about the way we have sponsored refugee families, especially the earlier ones. And in particular, the Harvest family, Diane Clark had something like 2 weeks to pull it all together.
Mm-hmm.
And it came together.
Yep.
That kind of speaks to the power of community. If you don't have some jungle drum to make some group of people aware, then there wouldn't be anything.
And the first men's breakfast Bud went to, they raised the issue of someone who their father had died or whatever, and they were in college and they weren't going to be able to go back the next semester.
Right. At that breakfast, Joe, maybe you were there. We raised enough money to keep that young lady in college.
Wow.
I don't think I was. I think I was out of town at that time.
Wow.
Thing if you ask people, if you put the word out there, you can suffer in silence, but if you ask for help, then sometimes you get it.
Well, I just flicked on Facebook for a minute this morning and saw somebody I know. I don't know what their cause was, but they have a GoFundMe thing. That's another thing that happens now. You put out a word of GoFundMe for somebody who's having cancer or whatever, and things happen.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and Barclay makes the point about, these two stories as well, contrasting selfishness versus generosity, and how Jesus teaches us.
The thing that struck me most, which I was unaware of, was that Jesus was out in a boat grieving. And I didn't ever really realize that first part of the story.
Yeah, that he was trying to get to the other side of the lake. And he did. He got to the other side of the lake and got there, and there was this crowd of 5,000 plus there.
Maybe a lesson there was, I've heard before, if you want to get rid of your own trouble, go help somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that was a version of that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. So however it was that, those was it 5 loaves and 2 fishes? Yep, 5 loaves and 2 fishes, how that became enough. We've all heard different explanations, and we've talked about them before, and we did Mark and Luke. However it was, that miracle was amazing. And Barclay makes the point on page 120 at the top, that top paragraph. In whatever way we approach the miracles of Jesus, one thing is certain. We must never be content to regard them as something which happened. We must always regard them as something which happens. And they are not isolated events in history. They are demonstrations of the always and forever operative power of Jesus Christ. And I think
One of the things that gets glossed over in that whole story is before he serves dinner, he heals all their sick. And that's amazing in and of itself, even if they never got to the part about everybody eating dinner together. I think we hear the healing story so much that sometimes they don't register with us. But that's amazing. I mean, if you've got friends and family who have terminal illnesses, that's amazing.
right. Yeah.
What's fish and bread when you've healed someone of leprosy?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. All right. So I'm moving on to the next passage. Which is another amazing story. So this is Matthew 14:22 through 7.
I'm willing to read it.
Okay. Okay.
Immediately he compelled his disciples to embark in the boat and go on ahead to the other side until he should send away the crowds. When he had sent away the crowds, he went up into a mountain by himself to pray. When it was late, he was there alone. The boat was by this time in the middle of the sea, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. About 3 a.m., he came to them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were alarmed. "This is an apparition," they said, and they cried out from fear. Immediately Jesus spoke to them. "Courage," he said, "it is I. Do not be afraid."
Whew. So again, Jesus, Jesus went off by himself. He was like, told the disciples, get back in the boat. You guys go on. I'll be with you. And so he sent away the crowd and went up in the mountain and had his time alone. And remember from Mark, multiple times in Mark, what was it, at least 9 times in Mark, that he went off by himself to pray. And when that, we see that here in Matthew as well. So in the middle of the night, when the wind had come up, as happens on the Sea of Galilee, and they see Jesus walking to them on the water, coming to them, and they were scared to death. And so he's like reassuring them, courage, it's me, don't be afraid. So Barclay makes the point about how, and this is getting into those interpretation, translation nuances, about where it talks in the latter part of this passage about on the sea, walking on the sea. That they're really two different Greek phrases that are used for that. That could be translated over the sea, towards the sea, or at the sea. So those prepositions being translated in different ways. Over, towards, and at. But or also could be the verb for walking means to walk about. To walk about, at, towards, on the sea. But I think most Bibles translate it on, but Barclay's making the point about those nuances. So in their hour of need, Jesus comes to the disciples. So we can easily see that in our hour of needs, when Jesus comes to us. And Barclay makes the final point that it's the sign and that coming to them on the water is the sign and symbol of what he always does for his people. When the wind is contrary and we are in danger of being overwhelmed by the storms of life. So I do enjoy how Barclay includes the richness of his own words in describing Jesus's actions and words. So Sarah, you want to read the second part of this passage because Barclay divides it up into two parts. And here we have Peter. You know, we all know Peter.
I love Peter.
I love Peter too because he reminds us of us. He's us.
Yeah. Okay. And Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, bid me come to you on the water. He said, come. Peter got down from the boat and walked on the water to come to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And when he began to sink below the water, he cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand and grasped him. O man of little faith, he said, why did you begin to have doubts? And when they got into the boat, the wind sank. And those in the boat knelt in reverence before him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God.
So Peter's impulsivity, I mean, how many of us, I mean, I would have been, scared to death in the boat, but I wouldn't have been about to say, a little cautious me, I wasn't about to say, well, Jesus, if you're out there, I'll come. But Peter was ready to go. So anyhow, and we'll see, again, in the different events in Peter's life that he has this great impulse, this great faith, and then he gets scared and backs up. And Jesus reaches out to him and grabs his arm. Then Jesus, in essence, pulls him out of the water. They get in the boat. The wind's calm. Jesus is with them. Things calm down. So how does this story, what comes to mind for you with this story?
I just had an interesting thought that when Jesus was with them, maybe it wasn't that the wind calmed, but that with his protective presence, their perceptions changed. We go through this challenging life at any stage, but when we know Jesus is with us, our perception of things is different.
I like that.
It just hit me.
Mm-hmm. Our perceptions change. They do. Yeah.
That reminds me of that old saying, there's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole.
True. Barclay, he offers his practical explanations, and this was one that I hadn't thought of before, that as far as there may, whether it was actually Jesus walking on water or that the disciples' boat had been driven by the wind into the shore and they didn't realize it's dark, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. They didn't realize it, and Jesus came up on them so suddenly as well, and they didn't know what was happening.
They
So,
were seasoned fishermen. They knew how to judge their position by the stars, and I don't know. If the boat had, come all the way to the shore, they would be aware.
Yeah, I think I kind of agree that something miraculous had to happen. It couldn't have been explained by he was walking by the edge of the sea and got his feet wet, and Peter got out of the boat and, sank,
He wouldn't sink if he was on shore.
He wouldn't sink if he was on shore,
Sure.
So, and for them to say, you are truly the Son of God, I mean, who else can control nature like that? The wind, I mean, and the sun and the wind and the lightning, how do you control that? You have to have a little bit of power.
Mhm.
And it was less than 24 hours earlier, they witnessed the feeding of this multitude. So it's one.
It was that evening. This was all in one.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're watching all of this unfold in such a short time, close enough to Jesus to be able to touch him. Yeah, that would evoke the response, you're the Son of God, but not if the boat runs on shore and we splash through the shallows.
Now, remember, at this point, Jesus' followers and disciples, they don't know about the resurrection.
I wouldn't need a resurrection. I mean, if I had just witnessed this past, like 12 hours, I'd be like, yep, Messiah's here.
No, it's like when I watch America's Got Talent and I see this really great magician, and I wonder, I know there is a trick to this, but I cannot figure this out. How this person can know this or do this, and so I'm just wondering, I see these tricks and I don't say, you've got to be the Son of God, because
No, but wait a minute, but we're living in today and we're not living at a point where there was no technology.
right.
Fakery was a lot more difficult to pull off.
All right, so I want to wrap this up with the last passage of chapter 14. So this is verses 34 and 30 to 36. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret. When the men of that place recognized him, they sent the news that he had come to the whole surrounding countryside, and they brought to him all those who were ill and besought him to be allowed only to touch the fringe of his robe, and all who touched him were restored to health. So Barclay describes this as this is just one of Matthew's almost colorless little connecting passages. I don't get that, but anyhow, so the men see that he's coming into Gennesaret, so they spread the word. People come, they're trying to protect Jesus. They only let them touch the fringe of his robe, and they're healed. So, Barclay makes the point, and we all know this, I think, that Jesus showed, and this is another passage, he showed God's love. He just didn't walk around wearing a bracelet, which I did at one point too, that said WWJD, what would Jesus do? And then that was gonna, it's what we do, and the faces that I see right here you live your lives that way. This is the way you're showing God's love by doing.
Kathy, we know you. You were not just walking around wearing a bracelet. There was a lot more.
Yes, I did. But Jesus showed us to show God's love as opposed to just walking around. I want to go back to the story of feeding the 5,000 that Barclay makes the point, and I think rightly so. The disciples' role in that, as far as taking those 5 loaves and fishes out and then collecting and bringing back in the work of the disciples. That story would not have happened without the work of the disciples. The disciples were a key element. And, so the analogy for us as the church.
That passage, that part of what Barclay said reminded me of the first play that I was in with Mary Kay Cyrus's drama group. And the title of it was, "This is God, I Need You." And the whole point of the play was that we are God's hands and feet and mouths on the earth.
Yep.
One of the things that as I listen to all these stories together, there's a pattern of Jesus going out and showing God's love and doing service, but then taking the time to go back by himself to more or less recharge his spiritual batteries. And I think he drew his strength from those times that he spent alone in prayer. And I think that's a very important part of all these stories that we probably need to understand. You can't serve all the time. You've got to take time to go back and be alone with God so that you can recharge. Otherwise you burn out.
Exactly. Yep. Yep. You do. You do. And we've all been there at some point or another. We all have. So, all right. So on that, I'm going to conclude Sunday school for today. Thank you for for being here and for your discussion and your offerings.